What happens when a nation makes a sacred vow to those who fought and bled side by side under its flag, only to erase that promise with the stroke of a pen? A uniform is more than just fabric. It is a contract of honor between a soldier and their country. When you wear it, you offer your life. In return, the nation offers its unwavering protection and gratitude. But what if the nation simply changes its mind? Today, we turn back to an agonizing yet profoundly proud chapter of history. We are going to explore the story of the Allied brothers America left behind, the decades-long heartache that followed, and the relentless, lifelong fight for justice waged by men who refused to be forgotten. In the late summer of 1941, the geopolitical climate of the world was reaching a boiling point. The dark clouds of war were rapidly gathering over the Pacific. In Washington, D.C., military leaders and intelligence analysts knew that a large-scale, devastating conflict was no longer a matter of if, but when. The Philippines, which was then a territory under the sovereignty of the United States, lay directly in the path of the impending storm. It was a vital strategic outpost, a cornerstone of the Allied defense line in the Far East. In that crucial, tension-filled moment, President Franklin D. Roosevelt recognized the absolute necessity of fortifying the islands. On the 26th of July 1941, he issued a special executive order that fundamentally altered the destiny of thousands. This order officially incorporated the Philippine Commonwealth Armed Forces into the United States Army Forces in the Far East. The call to action was crystal clear, echoing from the halls of Washington to the streets of Manila and the remote provinces of the archipelago. America needed the sons of the Philippines to take up arms, to dig the trenches, and to defend their shared homeland. The agreement was explicit. In return for their service, their blood, and their loyalty, these men would be recognized as genuine active-duty servicemen of the United States military. That promise carried the full, uncompromised benefits of an American veteran, including the highly coveted promise of United States citizenship, lifelong medical care, the WWII Bill benefits, and pensions to support them and their families after the war was won. Tens of thousands of young Filipino men did not hesitate for a single moment to answer that call. They left their families, their farms, and their quiet villages. They put on the uniform with a fierce, unwavering belief in the righteous cause of the Allies and the shared values of freedom, democracy, and liberty that bound them to America. They were proud to stand beneath the stars and stripes. When the guns finally roared and the skies darkened with bombers in December 1941, these native soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder with American troops in some of the most grueling, desperate battles the world had ever seen. The defense of the Philippines was a nightmare of attrition. Filipino and American soldiers were cut off from reinforcements, fighting a desperate holding action. They shared muddy, disease-ridden water deep in the sweltering jungles. They split their meager, dwindling rations of rice and canned meat. They faced overwhelming, relentless enemy firepower together, shivering in the same foxholes under deafening artillery barrages. On those brutal battlefields, where all hope seemed lost and the shadow of death loomed over every hour, there was no division of color, background, or nationality. In the trenches of Batan and the tunnels of Corregidor, they shared a single, unbreakable identity. They were brothers in arms. History recorded their staggering resilience during the absolute darkest days of the Allied forces in the Pacific theater. They held the line for months, disrupting enemy timetables and buying precious time for the United States to rebuild its fleet and organize a counteroffensive. But what awaited these brave men at the end of their long road of suffering was not the victor's laurel wreath, but rather one of the most ruthless and heartbreaking decisions in the history of military legislation. To truly understand the sheer magnitude of this sacrifice, we must look deeper at the backbone of this resistance: the Philippine Scouts and the Commonwealth Army. These were men who grew up on this tropical land. They knew every hidden valley, every rushing river, and every dense forest canopy. When regular United States forces were tactically outmaneuvered, vastly outnumbered, and severely undersupplied, the Filipino soldiers voluntarily became a human shield. They utilized their lifelong survival skills and extraordinary physical endurance to stall enemy advances. When the last fortresses finally fell, and senior commanders were forced to surrender to avoid total annihilation, the fighting spirit of the Filipino soldiers remained completely unbroken. The formal army may have capitulated, but the soldiers did not. Tens of thousands of them melted away, retreating deep into the treacherous mountain ranges and impenetrable jungles, organizing themselves into highly disciplined, elite guerrilla forces. For 3 agonizing years, under the dark, terrifying shadow of enemy occupation, they operated in absolute secrecy. They established dense, sophisticated intelligence networks that tracked enemy ship movements and troop deployments. They risked execution on a daily basis to smuggle food and medicine to American prisoners of war surviving in horrific camp conditions. They braved the dense wilderness to rescue downed Allied pilots, hiding them in their own villages. They constantly harassed enemy supply lines with devastating ambushes, ensuring that the occupying forces could never rest. They fought not just for the liberation of their homeland, but out of an absolute, unbreakable loyalty to the vow they had made to America. In their hearts and minds, they were American soldiers. They kept old American flags, carefully hidden in caves and buried in wooden boxes, waiting patiently for the day General MacArthur and the Allies would return. Each intelligence report sent over a crackling radio. Each ambush executed in the dead of night was paid for with blood, starvation, and the constant threat to the safety of their own wives and children. Finally, the end of the harrowing war arrived. In the fall of 1945, the world erupted in the overwhelming joy of victory and liberation. In the Philippines, the guerrilla fighters and surviving veterans emerged from the deep jungles and mountain hideouts. They were battered. They were emaciated, wearing rags, and carrying countless physical and invisible scars of war. But their eyes shone with immense pride. They had done the impossible. They had held on. They firmly believed that now, the sacred promise made in 1941 would be fulfilled. They believed their American brothers across the ocean would welcome them with open arms, honoring them as the saviors and heroes they truly were. But reality struck a cruel, devastating blow. In early 1946, as the smoke of war was barely clearing and the world was beginning to rebuild, the United States Congress passed the first Supplemental Surplus Appropriation Rescission Act, widely known simply as the Rescission Act. This legislative act delivered a cold, bureaucratic declaration that shattered the lives of thousands. It explicitly stated that the service of the Philippine Commonwealth Armed Forces would not be deemed active military service for the purposes of United States veteran benefits. With a single legislative maneuver, the veteran status of tens of thousands of soldiers was unceremoniously stripped away. The reasons often cited by politicians at the time were the massive post-war financial burden on the United States economy and the fact that America was preparing to formally grant the Philippines its independence later that year. Lawmakers argued that providing lifelong benefits to hundreds of thousands of foreign nationals would bankrupt the newly established Veterans Administration. But for the soldiers who had bled into the soil of Bataan, who had survived the death marches, and who had starved in the jungles for the Allied cause, no financial excuse could ever soothe the searing pain of betrayal. The greatest conflict these veterans faced in the aftermath was not economic. It was the deep, unhealable wound to their honor. From celebrated heroes of the Pacific, they suddenly became invisible strangers. Over the following decades, a stark and painful contrast emerged. While American veterans returned home to rebuild their lives, buy homes, and attend college with the generous support of the GI Bill creating the most prosperous middle class in history, thousands of Filipino veterans were left entirely to fend for themselves. Many lived in grinding poverty. They carried untreated war wounds, shrapnel still lodged in their bodies, and an endless, quiet heartache over a forgotten promise. They were denied entry into veterans' hospitals. They were denied the right to proudly call themselves U.S. veterans on official documents. But soldiers who have faced down enemy fire, who have survived the worst horrors humanity can inflict, do not easily surrender to the cold barriers of bureaucracy. A new kind of war began. This was not a war fought with rifles, artillery, or midnight ambushes. It was a war fought with petitions, peaceful marches, handwritten letters, and voices demanding justice, stretching over more than half a century. As the decades slowly passed, the vibrant young men of 1941 began to age. Their hair turned gray and then white. The strong legs that once crossed dense, muddy jungles now leaned heavily on canes and walkers. Heartbreakingly, thousands of these brave men passed away quietly in their sleep, never seeing their names cleared, taking the broken promise with them to their graves. But their fire was not extinguished. It was passed down. It was inherited by their children, their grandchildren, and the wider Filipino-American community. Veterans' rights organizations were formed, refusing to let the government forget. They constantly knocked on the heavy wooden doors of Congress, staging protests in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C., persistently bringing this suppressed story into the light of day. The Condidio, the true emotional climax of this generational story, unfolded during the congressional hearings in Washington in the early 21st century. The sight captured on camera was one that touched the hearts of millions across the nation. There, sitting in the grand halls of American power, were octogenarians and nonagenarians. They wore their old, carefully preserved uniforms, heavy with medals they had earned in the blood and mud of the Pacific. They stood trembling, some speaking through translators, before American lawmakers. Their message was profound and humbling. They made it abundantly clear that they were not fighting for material greed. For men in their 80s and 90s, delayed pension checks could not buy back their lost youth. It could not bring back the comrades they had buried in unmarked jungle graves. What they yearned for most was something far more invaluable: respect. They wanted an official, undeniable recognition from the very nation they had sworn to protect with their lives. They wanted history to accurately record that they were true American veterans. The relentless pressure of public opinion, combined with the tireless advocacy of a new generation of lawmakers and activists, finally forced the heavy wheels of history to turn. In 2009, as part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the U.S. government finally approved a compensation fund. It provided a one-time, lump sum payment to the surviving Filipino veterans. It was a step forward, a tangible acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done. But everyone, from the politicians to the veterans themselves, knew that money alone was fundamentally insufficient to compensate for stripped honor. The promise of $1,941 needed a much more fitting, permanent symbol to truly right the scales of history. And then, a beautiful, belated miracle arrived. In October 2017, more than 7 long decades after the guns of World War II fell silent, the United States Congress officially awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the Filipino veterans of World War II. This is America's highest civilian honor, a recognition reserved for those who have fundamentally shaped American history for the better. The ceremony held at the United States Capitol was deeply, overwhelmingly emotional. Under the Grand Dome, the elderly soldiers, many confined to wheelchairs, wept openly as they were finally officially called what they always had been: American heroes. The applause echoed through the chambers, a sound they had waited a lifetime to hear. For those who had already passed, tens of thousands of other medals were respectfully placed into the trembling hands of widows, children, and grandchildren. These descendants stood tall, receiving the glory and the vindication that their forefathers should have rightfully had 70 years prior. Though the sacred promise was kept only when the vast majority of those brave soldiers were already gone, their legacy will live forever in the annals of military history. The story of the Filipino World War II veterans is an immortal testament to a profound loyalty that remained unbroken by the passage of time, the cruelty of political calculation, or the sting of betrayal. They stand as a powerful reminder to all of us that the heavy price of freedom is built with the blood, sweat, and tears of many people from many different lands. History may have its dark silences. It may have its periods of unjust abandonment and bureaucratic cruelty, but the truth and the sheer, unyielding bravery of the human spirit will always eventually find its rightful, brilliant place in the collective memory of humanity. The selfless sacrifice of Allied soldiers must never, ever be allowed to fade into the forgotten corners of history. We owe it to them to remember. If this story of unbreakable loyalty and the lifelong journey for justice touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe so we can continue to honor our silent heroes. Leave a comment below. What must we do today, as a society, to ensure that no promise to our soldiers, our allies, and our forgotten heroes is ever broken again.